Now that we have, shall we say, cleaned the mind out of this false belief in innate speculative principles, this false belief in innate practical principles, this false belief of innate ideas, and just think of the mind as not a complete tabula rasa, scraped slate, not completely as a blank piece of paper, although Locke does use that metaphor. Be careful of that. He's a little sloppy about that. Think of the mind as coming into the world, or the soul, whatever spin you want to put on it, that it just doesn't have any knowledge. Absolutely, your mind has to come in with capacities. It has to have the capacity to learn. You can't have to where you have to completely learn how to learn. How that would create an infinite regress. It has natural tendencies, inclinations of the appetite towards certain things, like things that are good for it, and certain, shall we say, like pleasures, right? May not always be good for it, but certain things that it might think of as good, but it has natural inclinations towards things and natural aversions. So while the mind is not a complete blank slate, a complete tabula rasa, it's pretty scraped. Not just absolutely clean scraped, but pretty darn scraped. So with this, shall we say, fairly scraped tabula, what's the story? How does Locke begin to get ideas into the mind and build up his entire notion of knowledge? And how does this work? Well, he says, okay, ideas are the materials of reason and knowledge, okay? So it's a philosophy of ideas. We'll look more throughout the essay as to what he means by this, but remember, it's just whatever is before the mind when the mind thinks. So ideas are always in the mind. Remember that. And because we're going to introduce a distinction here that works with ideas, and it's going to deal with qualities. So qualities outside the mind, ideas inside the mind. Get that straight. If you don't, you will always be confused, and you'll get things wrong about Locke when he goes on and talks about different kinds of qualities. We'll dig into that, but for now, just get the distinction. Ideas in the mind, qualities in the external objects. More on that in a bit. So the materials are ideas. Ideas come from, as Locke says right at the beginning of Book 2, Chapter 1, in one word, where does all this stuff come from? Experience. So that's going to be a big thing in the empiricists. Experience. That's where all this stuff comes from. Hume talks like this as well. All about experience. Now, when we look at our experience, when we're examining and considering things, Locke says there's two directions that we have. Namely, the internal direction, when we look inside our minds, introspection, and when we look at objects out here, physical objects. Nothing too fancy. So when you're looking at the contents of your mind, or when you're looking at the external contents of the world. All right, so our observation is directed, and again, take this with a grain of salt, the notion of directed in two ways, because everything really is looking at what's in the mind, because the ideas are what you're looking at. That's what the mind looks at. The mind doesn't look directly at objects themselves. More on that later. But at least when you're looking at ideas that come from the external world, you're directed. That's why I put directed in scare quotes. You're directed externally or directed internally. So a little bit more of Locke's jargon. When you're directed externally, these are directed towards sensible external objects. Again, nothing fancy here. Cups, saucers, pens, whiteboards, wall, my hand, all that kind of stuff. Sensible external objects. And what do you get from those? You get ideas of sensation. So if you like sort of an image of it, is the body is in the world, right, doing its stuff, and the world bangs up against it and causes ideas in the mind. And those ideas that are caused by the world banging up against it are ideas of sensation. What's an idea of sensation? I don't know, look at this whiteboard, an idea of white. An idea of blue, or blue stripes and white stripes, whatever. So ideas of yellow, of cold, of wet. So those ideas are, shall we say, in the mind, but they're directed towards the external reality. So Locke is taking a lot for granted. Yeah, there's minds, there's a world, there's external objects in the world, and those external objects cause ideas in our mind. And if they come from the world, they're objects, these are ideas of sensation. So get that straight. Ideas of sensation are directed externally, and you also have, when you look internally, like when you introspect, those are directed towards internal objects. Now, what's an internal object? Aren't ideas also internal? Yeah, they are. So this is where we have to be careful about our terminology, but you got to get this straight. So when Locke is talking about you're looking internally, you're doing some introspection, you're really looking at the internal objects. So again, internal objects, like the operation of your mind, right? So in this sense, when you're introspecting and you're looking at how the mind is operating on ideas. So yeah, you're looking at ideas which have, also, if they're ideas of sensation, they may have an external direction, but you can also get ideas by looking at the internal operations of your mind. So you get ideas of, shall we say, they're called ideas of reflection. So when you look internally, you look at the operations of our minds and the products of these operations. Don't worry too much about what that is yet. Just get the main distinction. Ideas coming in that are caused by the outside, ideas of sensation, ideas that are caused by our introspection, when we're looking at what's going on in our heads, ideas of reflection. Now, Locke uses this term, operations, in a fairly broad sense. So, think of this, these ideas of reflection, right? So the mind would get ideas of reflection, like an idea of believing. So when you look at your mind as it's undergoing a process, and you just get an idea of a cat, then you also have ideas about believing, like you might believe the cat is out there. Well, where do you get that idea of believing? Not the belief itself, but the very, we might say the concept, but the very notion, the very idea of believing, or the idea of remembering, or these kinds of other, the idea of doubting. So idea of believing, remembering, doubting. Where do those ideas come from? Those come from when you look at the operation of your mind. You can also have products of these operations. We'll look at that in a second. But so Locke has a bit broader of a notion of operation of a mind, because he says you also get ideas of passions. So some beliefs that we have, some ideas, can cause us to feel good, can feel happy, joy, and some can cause us to feel uncomfortable. So how do you get the idea of joy? Well, it's from some idea, that it's from operating, your mind's operating on ideas, and then those will then create more ideas. So you'll get ideas of believing and ideas of discomfort, idea of joy, or on all the kinds of language that we use when we, I'm not talking about anything that pretty well every one of us understands. Like, when I say the word joy, you know what that means. Well, how did you come to know what the word joy means? Locke says it's an operation of your mind, of having joy, and you reflected on that operation of your mind, and you get an idea of joy from that. So we learn all these terms. You weren't born knowing the idea of joy. You learned it through experience by basically watching your own mind at work. You weren't born knowing what believing means. You learned what that means by watching, observing internally, introspection. All right, so these ideas of sensation and the ideas of reflection, so ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection, that's the source, or those two form the great source of all our ideas. And all our ideas must be traced back to one or the other, or some combination thereof. So that's the plain historical method. We can now unpack that a little bit and say the plain historic method that Locke talked about right at the beginning of the essay was to look at an idea that we have, whatever it happens to be, and we can analyze the history of that idea by ultimately saying, well, I can trace it back into the idea of ideas from sensation or ideas of reflection. I can tell its history, its story, the plain historic method of ideas. All right. So all this is before us. And why don't we notice all this? Locke says, because we don't pay attention. I mean, how often do you pay attention to all the intricacies of the things you see in your environment? You walk around. If you take the same route to school every day, there would be a number of things you would remember about the route. But if I carefully walked along your route with you, I could probably just randomly point out things that might have just happened to strike me at a moment, or someone else could point them out that you have never noticed. So this fact that we go through our lives and we're presented with all kinds of things that we don't notice, Locke says that's part of being human. We all do that. That's not a big deal. But if you really want to know more about how your mind works, you have to have, as he says, a very focused attention and start paying close attention to what's going on in your actual experience. Most of us, we just do the things we do and we don't pay attention to what we're doing. Locke is saying we're going to do a close examination. That is, we're going to do a lot of introspection and we're going to do a lot of observation about our ideas and how our mind works. This study of the mind by introspection, this is the dominant mode of doing epistemology and philosophy, lasts for centuries. And a lot of philosophers today still talk about it, but it's not the only way to do it. You could do a more scientific one where it's not through introspection, but through lab experiments and analyze the data of people's behaviors. But this is the style, philosophy by introspection. Now, the rest of this chapter, so we're still in chapter 1, right? Chapter 1 of book 2. The rest of this chapter contains a rather lengthy discussion that strikes many of us today as kind of bizarre, that Locke goes off into this large discussion of whether or not the mind constantly thinks. Now, what's the point of that? Why is Locke getting so embroiled in this? And he's debating this and he's turning it around and examining it. Eventually he thinks it doesn't. But why would he even worry about it? Like, why is Locke all of a sudden concerned about whether the mind constantly thinks? As he says, sure, we have evidence the mind thinks sometimes, but, every time we nod off, he says, doesn't that show that the mind doesn't think? And Locke says, basically, there are lots of times when the mind doesn't think. So why does he worry about this? Well, this is an example of a problem that was, shall we say, in the air. In the environment, people were worried about it at the time. Why were they worried about it? Well, it has something to do with the nature of the soul, and the soul's nature being that it is some kind of entity, some kind of object whose very essence is to think. Right? So once you start saying that the soul's very essence is to think, then you run into weird problems like, well, if it stops thinking, does it mean it's not really a soul anymore? How does that work? So a lot of these issues that Locke dives into, shall we say, are in the air, they're products of the time, and they're not really critical for us to understand in detail in order just to understand what Locke is doing in the larger context of the essay. But it is a good historical analysis of a problem that was then important and current. And it's also a good thing to go through Locke's discussion, but because it shows him applying his plain historic method to a problem of the day and coming up with a solution. Namely, he says, yeah, the soul doesn't think, but that's not going to be a huge problem in the end. And you'll see Locke lapse sometimes into faith like, well, God wouldn't make us such that we disappeared if we stopped thinking. All right. So that's basically your chapter 1 of book 2. So let's have another look now and dive into chapter 2. So Locke is still of ideas in general, and this video lecture is part 1 because part 2 will go more detail of ideas. But we have what we could list as a kind of chart to put some of this together. I've divided this up because, as we've seen, we have 2 shall we say, directions of our observation, external and internal. And we labeled the ones that were external, right? Things coming in from sensation, and things coming in, ideas coming from the internal one as reflection. Locke introduces another term here, that ideas can be simple and they can be complex. Simple ideas are, shall we say, the ultimate building blocks. They're the smallest, if you like, the smallest units of experience. So the external objects contain the qualities, so I'm going to bring that distinction back in. The external objects contain the qualities, and the mind has the ideas. So remember, ideas in the mind, qualities in the objects. And we're going to unpack this a little bit more as we go along. Even in the next couple of videos, we'll talk more about qualities, to just make sure you understand, though, that those are in the object. Ideas are in the mind. So the external objects have these qualities. These qualities then, as I told before, they interact with our bodies. So our bodies are kind of like an aerial or something. They pick up what's going on in the environment, and then ideas form in the mind. Now, Locke uses this distinction all the time between ideas and qualities. So again, you have to get it straight. Now, Locke says quite clearly, you might be wondering, well, how are ideas produced in the mind? Like how do qualities engender, how does this engender ideas in the mind and all this? Locke is not interested in that here. He doesn't really go into detail, although it slips out in various places in the essay, his view, namely that it's a mechanical type of a process, that the world is sort of composed of little particles, the corpuscular theory it was called. And these would bang up and cause vibrations, and the vibrations would eventually transmute and cause ideas to appear in the soul. That whole mechanical process Locke is not dealing with. He says he's not interested in it. However, he was a physician, so by training, so he was very interested in how the body works, but that's not his point here. His point here is just to do philosophy. Not natural philosophy, but philosophy in the sense of epistemology. So, Locke says something like this, that the qualities in external objects are blended, but they're not but they don't have a corresponding blend of ideas in the mind, that the mind can do other things with ideas that differentiates what is done with qualities. This all sounds very mysterious. So I think a simple example will help. And this apple will reappear in a variety of our discussions, and I'll make it, shall we say, I'm not going to give you all the information at once. I'm going to start off with some simple distinctions, and in later video lectures, I'll return to the apple and flesh this out in some more detail. So keep that in mind, that I'm just starting the process out. All right, so here we have, this is the, shall we say, this is the external world, and of course, here's the internal world. The internal world is one of ideas. The external world is one of qualities. And when qualities are kind of bound up together, we name them. A certain set of qualities that are all bound up together, we call that an apple. So this apple will have qualities, such as, and these are qualities now, such that it will have its sweetness, hardness, all these kinds of things. It will have have its redness and shape. Okay. Now, for now, I'm just talking about these as qualities. Locke will dig in a little bit more. Stay tuned for that. He will divide these up, these qualities. He will analyze this out, and he will talk about two different kinds of qualities. But I'm not going to get into all that now. I'm putting it all in scare quotes here, that somehow Locke wants to say that these things are qualities in the apple, and how he unpacks that will be a little bit later. So here, though, we have ideas. So we have a quality of sweetness. So imagine the word quality of sweetness, quality of hardness, quality of redness. Here, I'll write it out in a little. We have the idea of sweetness, the idea of hardness, and then as we go along, the idea of redness, and the idea of shape. All right, so far so good. You got the quality of sweetness, qualities over here, ideas of those over here. So this is, so as Locke says, it's always what's before the mind is an idea. So that's really what you're seeing are the ideas. That's what your mind is working with. And there's an external world out here where you have all the qualities. Now, I said that Locke regards the qualities as blended, right? Now think about it. Think about an actual apple. These qualities, these are all blended. In other words, the apple is a unity. It's not just, well, there's sweetness over there, and then there's hardness over here, and then red. No, they're all, shall we say, you can think of them as interpenetrating or whatever term or whatever image you want to use, but they're all blended together. So the sweetness, you can't put it this way, you can't walk up to an apple and just point to it because and I would know what you mean, because if you just pointed to the apple, I'm not sure if you're pointing at its shape. I'm not sure if you're pointing at its sweetness, although that sounds a little weird, but I don't know if you're pointing at its color. So these ideas, these qualities, they are blended in the object, right? Because the object is a unity. And this, Locke makes an important point. Rarely do you ever get a quality just by itself, like shape. You never encounter shape just by itself or color just by itself. You encounter something that is shaped and it's colored too. So it's a blue shape or a green shape, a green circle or a green square or a blue triangle. So Locke says that these things are blended. However, the mind, when it gets this idea it has an idea of an apple. So there's two things going on here. All right, so this is a way to flesh out what we mean by simple and complex. The apple is a unity. It's got all these qualities that are blended, so they're all mixed together. When you get the idea of an apple, right, as you get the idea by you look at the apple, the world is more or less presenting you with a unity, right? And what do you have? You have an idea of an apple, which is a complex idea. So this is a complex, which reflects the blended nature of the qualities. So you have a complex idea. And what does a complex idea suggest? Well, that it can be broken down into simple ideas. These would be the simple ideas. You don't see them or experience them separately, right? Because even when you're biting the apple, you're getting a variety of things you experience, like the hardness and the sweetness, and you're seeing the color, etc., and you're feeling it. There's all kinds of things. But what you can do is break that up in your mind, right? We can talk about the sweetness by just isolating the idea, or the color by just isolating the redness in our minds. So our minds they're very powerful. They can move ideas around, right? They can separate them. So what comes in as a complex idea, you can mentally analyze out into its simple components. Nature comes with these things as a unity. You can't really pull these apart. The qualities come in chunks, but in our mind, if they come together in a complex idea, we can break it up. So you can have, from sensation, you can have a simple idea of sensation, like just a color, but those are pretty rare. Those are almost, maybe something that you don't ever quite experience, but you can experience, as Locke says, some things that are fairly simple, but think of this as kind of an ideal limit. Then you can have a simple idea of reflection, like maybe just believing. Or maybe you could reflect on your own mind and get a much, much more complex idea of a mental process. ambivalence or something that involves a number of things, which you could then analyze out into simple ideas of reflection. And then you could have a complex idea of sensation, your idea of an apple, right? And which you then break into simple ideas of sensation. And of course, again, you can have complex ideas of reflection. So we have basically 4 possibilities, and we'll look more in detail as we go along how Locke starts to unpack these. So this complex idea comes into the mind. Your mind didn't have to do anything, but as Locke says, your mind is a very powerful one. You can, however, run into its limits. So the mind, for as simple ideas, the mind cannot break down a simple idea. Can't break that down any further. Your mind can break down complex ideas, but bang, once it hits a simple idea, can't break it down any further. You can't break red down any further. Locke says that's just a fundamental unit, shall we say, of experience, is the idea of red. Can't analyze it out, right? You can't see what it's composed of, right? But apple you sure can. That's a complex idea. You can analyze that out, but eventually you analyze it into its ultimate parts, simple ideas. So these, once you hit upon that, that's it. Experience is an association ultimately into complex ideas of simple ideas. So hence Locke is regarded as offering us an associationist psychology. Why is that? Once again, simple ideas are associated with each other, just like qualities are associated in the world to form objects. Ideas are associated to form complex ideas. So the two are more or less mirror images, but not quite. We'll dig a little bit more into that. But roughly, structurally, one side resembles the other. So qualities on one side, ideas on the other. The mind cannot break down a simple idea. It can only rearrange them, work them up with others. And the mind cannot break down and cannot create a simple idea. Locke says, he's very clear about this. He's like, you cannot just conjure up in your soul a simple idea. That is, you can remember one, fine. But if you've never seen or tasted, let's say there's some food you've never had, and it's totally different. Everyone says you've never ever had it before. You can't just conjure up a simple idea. You can imagine possibilities, but you would be basing those on things you've already eaten. But you would not be able to conjure up a simple idea of the taste of that food. You can't do it. Your mind is limited because it doesn't have that idea that simple idea unless it came in through experience. You can't just dream it up. So these simple ideas, whether they originate in sensation or the mind operating on things and then watching its own operations, you can get simple ideas there. Otherwise, the simple ideas are just something that the mind works with and creates more complex ideas. So this is, again, Locke reinforcing that all we have are ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection. We can't create these things ex nihilo. The mind is not like that. So what can we do? Even though we're limited, we can do a lot of stuff. Think about it. We can work with, and most of the work we do is the creation of complex ideas. Simple one. I take the simple, an easy, shall we say, complex idea. I take the simple idea of fire, join it with which I got from experience. I join that with a complex idea that I got from experience of a lizard. And I knit the two together, fire and a lizard, I get a created, an artificial, complex idea, and I call it a dragon. So this ability that we have is extraordinarily powerful. And you can also see how it applies to our learning, how our learning gives us complex ideas, enables us to create more complex ideas. So the mind can't destroy, so it can't break down a simple idea, it cannot create a simple idea, and last, it cannot destroy a simple idea. So once you get the simple idea of red, Okay, you can't break it down any further. You're stuck with it. You can't get rid of red, right? Unless something goes wrong and memory fails or whatever. But by and large, rock is like once it's in there, it's in there. You can't break it down, analyze it out. You couldn't. It didn't get in there through your creation, and you can't destroy it. So this is the bedrock of everything. Are these simple ideas, whether they come from sensation or reflection? Everything else is ultimately built of those. And if something comes in as a complex idea, your mind can analyze it out into your simple ideas, which is what we do in everyday life, whether it's talking about food or books or doing science. It's simply the analysis and working on of ideas. We can't, and Locke ends his discussion of chapter 2 on a theological note. We cannot help believing, though, that God could create beings with very different senses than ours. Locke says, I'm just going with the 5, right? The 5 regular ones that we have. So experience will be when we talk about sensation, it's the 5 regular senses. So ideas of sights, touches, and smells, etc., etc. So just the 5. It's possible, yeah, we can't help but believe that God could create creatures with all kinds of fantastic senses that we don't have no clue of. But that's the point. God could create stuff that we can imagine him creating it, but we really can't imagine what those senses would be. Right? So we don't limit God, but our ability to understand what he could do in creating organisms with other senses, that's beyond our ability. So there you go. That's the basics. So far, that's part 1 of ideas in general. But as I've said, we've got a lot more work because this picture is just the start. This will have to be fleshed out in more detail. The types of qualities and how this picture works in a little bit in a more fine-grained way. That's for our next video. Stay tuned.